start. All right, first of all, this is the outline for the sessions. This is session 4 that we're going to be doing this evening. And then session 5 is going to be 2 weeks from now, because 1 week from now is Labor Day. And I don't think we would have anyone wanting to attend on Labor Day evening. So we're going to skip next week, but the final session will be on September 13th. At that final session, we're going to be looking at some recent efforts in using land value taxation around the world. It should be kind of a fun way of completing everything. This is my background. Basically, it shows in particular the parts I've had in the assessment field in particular. So tonight it's session 4. We're going to start by talking about land rental capture, estimated land market value, and estimating land rental value. And we're going to be using 7 different methods in accomplishing that. Now, I support the theories of Henry George and the Henry George School. And in particular, I recognize that association inequality is the law of human progress. And George, quoting him, was to abolish all taxation, save that upon land values. And that's what got me into the field of assessing. Session 3, I'm going to just go over briefly. We talked about Henry George's theories, in particular, the cause of chronic poverty and the cycles of boom and bust, and how he would cure those 2 problems. We then talked about planning for a revaluation project and applying valuation models. And we used Greenwich, Connecticut, where I'd actually done a revaluation in 2005 and 2010. And I went through the actual mechanisms that we used. The importance of land rent. Land rent is a primary source of public revenue, and collecting land rent could reduce taxes on wages, buildings, workers, producers, merchants, and it could enhance the wealth of all people. Why collect land rent? And I've been pointing this out at each session. Land rent is created by all people, and land rent belongs to all people. Land rent is adequate to fund all public purposes. Real estate includes land and buildings, and the characteristics of land and the characteristics of buildings are different. Buildings are created by man's labor and incur a cost to produce. They wear out over time, and buildings can be located wherever desired and used for any purpose. Land is freely supplied by nature. It's not made by man. There is no cost of production. It's fixed in supply and it's immobile. And it includes natural resources. Land rent basically is land, but not including the buildings. Land rent is the price that's paid annually with the exclusive right to use a site. The ecological and social gifts of nature, not the activities of owners. Demand is the sole rent determinant. Public revenue. Land rent is optimal for public revenue. Public benefits received. It's reducing taxes on workers, producers, merchants, It increases productivity, efficiency, and equity. So total rent is the equivalent of land rent plus building rent. And what adds to the land value? Natural features, demand, infrastructure, public utilities, police and fire protection, public services, healthcare, education, recreation, preservation, social well-being, community services, amenities. Virtually everything that's provided by the public goes into increasing land value and land rent. It's a growing revenue base. The land rent exists, whether the community collects it or allows people to retain the values that have been created by the community. And the community should collect the land rent to ensure a sustainable and growing source of funds to continue public service needs. The real property tax is really two taxes, one on the value of land and one on the value of improvements. The market value of land is the capitalized flow of economic rent that comes from its location and community provided services. And the market value improvements reflects their cost of creation, replacement, and depreciation. And why collect land rents? Collecting land rents fosters the most efficient, highest and best use of land. It encourages urban development. It reverses the sprawl into the farmland. And it forces land speculators to build or sell to recover their carrying costs, reducing premature land use, and funds public service needs. Basically, the collecting of land rent has all of the advantage of properly using land and forcing people to use it properly rather than to use it wastefully. So economic results, land would cost less. New businesses would start. There'd be new investment in production. There'd be opportunities for people to be productive. There'd be new jobs created and wages would increase. We get into the assessment part now after that kind of introduction about my feelings about why we should be collecting land rent. There's eight basic procedures in doing a land assessment. You start by defining the assignment, then determining the data that's required and where you're going to get that data, then collecting and recording the data, then verifying the data, then analyzing and interpreting the data, then estimating the land market and rental values, having the public examination and questioning of the land values, and then the updating of the assessments periodically. As I've mentioned in the prior classes, there are three approaches that are used to estimate land rental or market value for a site: the cost approach, the market approach, and the income approach. Just in summary, the cost approach began by estimating the land value and then adding to the land value the depreciated building value. So total rent equals the land rent plus the building rent. And when any two of those factors are known, the third can be calculated as a residual rent. So the basic is that land rent plus building rent equals total rent. I give you an example of the land rent being $800, the building rent being $1,200, the total rent being $2,000. I said that we could determine what the building rent or the land rent would be by simply subtracting it out. If land rent plus building rent equals total rent, then building rent would be total rent less land rent. And land rent would be total rent less building rent. This is how you would then calculate what the land rent or the building rent would be. The second approach to value is the market approach. And you use comparable market sales and rentals, making adjustments for differences to estimate what value or rent would be paid for a land site. And in looking at land comparisons, you have vacant land sales, of course. You have tear down sales where a property is built with a rundown building on it, and it's torn down and redeveloped. And then every sale basically has a land component. So you look at every sale, and based upon the sales, you're able to find the land residual part of the sale. And then finally, you also have ground rent lease land. In Southern California, we do have a lot of examples of land being leased. The third approach to value is the income approach to value. And the formula is simply value equals income divided by rate. To be more specific, market value, which could be the selling price or the assessment, is equal to the net income, which is the rent income, minus expenses, and then divided by a capitalization rate. And we're going to get into the specifics of all of these in a few minutes. So how do we use real estate formulas? When two factors are known, the third can be calculated. So for assumption purposes, we're going to have a property that was sold for $30,000 at a net income of $1,800 and a capitalization rate of 6%. So here's the basic formula. Using the formula of value equals net rent divided by cap rate, through simple algebra, we can determine the net rent, which would be the value times the cap rate. And we can determine the cap rate simply by what the net rent is divided by the value. So this is the basic formulas that the assessors use when they want to estimate either value, market value, or assessed value, or they want to estimate what the net rent of a property would be, or they want to determine what a capitalization rate for that type of property would be. So as an example, to estimate the market value, the assessor then would divide the net income, and in this case, it was $1,800, by the capitalization rate, which is 6%, which would determine then a market value of $30,000. So the formula to estimate rent that we determine would be the rent, net income, would be equal to the value times the rate. An example then would be that the rent or the net income would be the value 30,000 times the rate. The rate was 6%. So the rent would be $1,800. And then the formula to estimate the cap rate. There again, the formula is the capitalization rate is equal to the net rent divided by the value. And as the example, the Net rent was $1,800. The value was $30,000. So the cap rate would be 6%. So those are the formulas that assessors basically use when they want to determine what cap rates are, or what rental rates are, or what market values are. I want to present one other factor here, and that is land rent taxation. When only a small amount of land rent is collected, and most of the land rent is held by the owner, land prices remain high. But when a large land rent is collected, land prices are reduced. And I want to be sure that everyone understands that land rent taxation does not reduce rent at all. It reduces land values. Let me just say that again, because when we're talking about land rent taxation and applying it, yes, it does reduce land prices, but it never reduces land rent. Land rent continues on at the same amount. So that by taxing land, you're not going to be reducing the benefits of land. You would only be reducing the land prices that would result in the hands of the owner. So I've added this one other element then to the formulas that we just went over, and that is that value equals net income minus tax divided by the capitalization rate. So the tax, the T in this formula would be the tax on land rent, or the fee for the land use. So plugging it in then to the formula for estimating market value, we start with a small amount of land rent. And I say, if the total rent was $2,000 and we were collecting $200, that would be a net amount of $1,800 that would be capitalized by 6% cap rate. That means that the land value would be $30,000. But what if we collected a much larger land rent? In this example, I've said $1,400 rather than $200. That would yield then $600 net rent. That divided by the cap rate of 6% would be $10,000. So in the one case with a small land rent, which we generally have in our country and most countries around the world, that land value is going to be $30,000. But if a large land rent tax were collected, that same $30,000 site still produces the same $2,000 of annual benefit, but the value would be only $10,000. Remember again that the productive value does not change. These formulas indicate how simple it is to translate a market value to rental value or vice versa. If only a small amount of land rent remained to be capitalized after land taxes were collected, land would have a lower market value. It would, however, continue to have the same rental or productive value to the community. So I said that I was going to talk about 7 methods that can be used to appraise land rental value or land market value. And oftentimes I've heard people complain that, well, the assessor doesn't have enough information in order to do a good job of assessing land values. So I'm going to go over 7 methods that an appraiser or an assessor could use at estimating land rental or land market value. And I'll just do them one by one at this point. First, land rental or sales comparison. Using market sales or rentals to estimate what value or rent would be paid for a land site, assuming that a competitive open market existed with knowledgeable people who are typically motivated and acting in their own best interest. Assessors and appraisers often use standard units of measure. And you've probably heard about a per square foot value generally. Oftentimes, you would divide the value of a property by the number of square feet in order to come up with a value per square foot. You could also, for example, divide the total value by a typical dwelling site. Or you could, for farms and rural areas, value it on a per acre basis. And for retail, you could use a per front foot basis. So these are the common measures that assessors use when they talk about comparing properties one with another. And sale or rent adjustments. Adjustments are made when there are desirable characteristics or undesirable characteristics. If it's a desirable characteristics, it's a positive adjustment, such as a superior location or a better view or better topography, services, or access. Those are positive, desirable adjustments. The assessor then would look at making negative adjustments for undesirable characteristics, such as poor location, a longer distance to transportation, longer distance to the civic center, wet ground in the winter, overabundance of rock or poor access. This just gives you the idea of making positive and negative adjustments. And I've kind of listed those that I've found to be significant. And probably the most important one has always been location. And then size. People pay more for of course, for a larger site than for a smaller site. And topography is very important. And traffic can be a negative factor if it's on a busy street where they have a residential property. Zoning, its use density. Having ocean frontage is a major plus. Regulations, having a level site. If it isn't level, you have to level it in order to build on it. Having a good view. Close to transportation. Avoiding unfavorable noise. Access, frontage, etc. So I've done a land adjustment grid. And I have on this grid, this could be either for doing a land value or a land rental calculation. On this one, I've set it up to be a land value. And I have said what would be the standard in the area, and then what would be a superior and what would be an inferior. And then I looked at the major variables or characteristics. And I said, well, I know that the basic value for most properties, most home sites, for example, is $80,000. So I started with that. And then I found that the distance to downtown was important in people's minds. And if it was within 5 miles, it had a greater value than if it was further out. And then I found out that in this particular subdivision, that size was typically 10,000 square feet. And I found out that the transportation could be achieved by bus in 3 blocks. And there was good recreational facilities in 6 blocks. So then I looked at the superior properties, and for downtown distance, instead of being 5 miles, if you were only 3 miles, that was a positive adjustment. On the other hand, if you were 7 miles, that required a negative adjustment. Looking at the size of the lot, 10,000 square feet being typical, But if it was larger, you'd make a positive adjustment. And if it was smaller, you'd make a negative adjustment. Then transport, how many blocks to the bus line or the subway. 3 being the standard, 1 being exceptionally good, and 6 being not so good. And then recreation being 6 blocks away compared to 3 being more desirable or 10 being less desirable. Now, of course, these adjustments would be made for each lot, and most lots would only have like 1 or 2 adjustments. And it could be other adjustment factors other than these 4 that I've mentioned. But typically starting with 80,000 as being what was typical, there might be typically an adjustment of $1,000 or $2,000 for whatever reasons were different. The most superior possible lot would be, instead of being 80,000, it could be as much as 100,000. And the least desirable, instead of being 80,000, would be 63,000. In reality, though, most lots would come within a few percentage points, a few $1,000s of being what is typical. Then Thurnan's law, land rent curve, basically he specified how the distance to the focal point, the downtown or the desirable point, has such a great value near that focal point, downtown or the commercial center. And then as they went out further from the focal point, it would decline, but it would decline at a lesser amount. Most of that increase was all right near the focal point. And this is actually showing values in land values in Johannesburg, South Africa. And you can kind of see that central core, how valuable that land was, that it was just like a skyscraper of land value. And then going out further, you saw it being much less. And then going out on some of the commercial type streets, it was higher than the residential, but it was not anywhere near that downtown area. All right, so that was discussion of the first, was the direct comparison. The second of the 7 methods is what I've known as the proportional land rental relationship. In the early 1990s, I was a consultant in several cities in Russia and Estonia. And these cities included Novgorod, St. Petersburg, Kaliningrad, and Tallinn. There was limited available data on land or real estate sales or rentals. And based upon observing data in other jurisdictions, a value for differing properties can be developed. This is something that I worked on and actually developed myself. And it was initially Steve Cord that asked me to work on this to some degree, saying, well, what if you don't have any good evidence? What can you do? And I created what I've called this table of proportional land values. And I decided that the standard residential lot would be my base 1. And then I would compare everything else in a community as a percentage or a value difference to that 1. And so on this 1, and I also put it down to where we looked at the use first. I had the commercial, then the industrial, then the residential, then the rural and farming. And then I looked at the type of district, the major part of the city, a more suburban part of the city, a developing part of the city, or a rural district. So then going back to my 1, I thought, well, what would be the very best residential sites? And they would, of course, vary quite a bit depending upon how close they were to the standard. It might go up to being 50% better in a prime location, or being 35% less in an inferior location. And then from that, I I went out and looked at the suburban areas and found that they were generally valued about 25% less than the prime downtown areas. And going into the developing areas, about 60%, and the rural areas, about 40% for the residential. Then looking at the commercial, I did the same. The central business district, of course, being the most valuable, being 20, the downtown area being 10, standard commercial, 3, and secondary commercial, 150. Then looking at the suburban, going out into the different ways. And then looking at the rural, acreage in particular, farming at the bottom. So I put it in acreage close in, acreage distant, and intense farming and general farming. And these were the percentages that I found. That farming just wasn't that valuable in comparison with all the other uses of the properties. That acreage close in might be like 20%, suburban might be 15%, developing 10%, and 5%. So based upon this analysis, I looked at just showing it in a graphic way here, putting the residential first and then the commercial second. And graphically, you can see how much more value the commercial properties have compared to the residential properties. And you can see that the inferior residential have a much lower value than the prime residential or the superior residential. The same is true with the commercial. The colors indicated rural being the smallest, the outlying, the suburban, and the major city. So I merely took that last chart and I showed it here so you get some kind of feeling of how the values vary. And then I've mentioned the value of land value maps. The land rents which have been calculated should be displayed on a land rental map. And there's modern geographic information systems, GIS software that can display these values, along with various relative factors that have been used to arrive at them. This will allow the assessor to review his market data and market value conclusions. One can then judge whether equity has been achieved based upon looking at the maps. A field route review will allow them to make further adjustments that may be necessary for different variables that they observe in the field or that the public brings to their attention. It allows the assessor then to finish the job having kind of a field view of what they've done. The assessor will then find, when the results of the analysis are presented, the major adjustment criteria utilized that the public can understand the logic of the assessments in the same way that the appraisers who actually calculated the land assessments went about calculating them. And it allows the public then to kind of participate in accepting the fact that some sites are more valuable than others. And this map again is from Greenwich, Connecticut. And the lightest green were the lower values. These were the large lots with big houses on them. But as you got closer to the city, it got more intensely green. And as you got really into the best parts of the city, you were a short distance into things, you got into these blues. And this kind of purple area is the central business district where Greenwich is famous for some of its famous shops. Also notice how the waterfront land values had a much higher value than other places right along the oceans here. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3 then is developmental analysis. And on this one, we're going to build a hypothetical building. And we're going to come up with land value as a residual. And I'm going to be using this as on a per square foot basis. And then capitalized at 6, the land value would be the land income capitalized at 6%. So I'm looking first at land income in this column. Then when we're done with that, we'll look at land value over here. So we look at what that hypothetical building could produce in terms of total income. And I've come up with $24 a square foot. Over its life, there's going to be a vacancy allowance. You know, over a period of years, you don't have the building rented all the time. I found that $1 would be a fair vacancy allowance. And there's operating expenses that are not reimbursed that the owner must bear. I've used $5 as that. So coming from a gross possible income of $24, what the net income before the land taxes are taken out would be $18. And that capitalized by the 6% would mean a market value of $300 a square foot. Now you have to, in order to estimate the land value, you have to recapture the building value. And I've calculated that the building value represents about 2/3 of the value, and that the cost of $12 would then leave a $6 land residual for the land. You still then tax the land. I'm assuming that a $3 tax would be used, which will leave a net land income of $3. So you're looking at the capitalized, the market value would be $300. After recapturing the building value, it would come up with a land residual of $100, the land tax of $50, or a net land income of $50 per square foot. Here you can see how it's easy to come up with both, either using a rental income approach or a land approach. And you could easily calculate the rental values for all the properties or the market value for all the properties. The fourth of the 7 methods is the allocation land ratio. There tends to be a typical ratio of land value to property value. That is the land plus building property value. And I've come up with a sample of 4 properties here that I've numbered. And I have their total selling price. And I was able to estimate the portion that would be allocable to the building, which would then leave a land residual, a portion that was residual to the land. And I developed a relationship between the land part and the total part. So the land in this first case represented 40%. And in the second case, it represented 42%. In the third case, 39%. In the fourth case, 38%. I was able then to indicate that what was typical in this particular district was a relationship of 40%. So that in this district, 60% was building value, 40% was land value. I did the same for rents because, we're looking at doing this on a rental basis and looking at the relationship between the total rent, the building part of the rent, the land part of the rent, and then the relationship. Again, I came up with percentages of 40, 42, 39, 38, a land factor of 40. I could then go to other properties that were not sold properties, or that I could come up with estimating based upon this 40% land factor what the land portion would be. And that way you're able to estimate land throughout. Here's the graph I did for it, the blue being the total value, the red being the building value, and the green being the land value for the 4 different properties in that example. Okay, number 5 then of the 7 methods is an extraction of land. The assessor finds that in downtown areas in particular, there are old buildings that really have very little value. that owners are holding on to basically because they're able to extract a little bit of rent out, and eventually they will sell it for strictly land value. This is quite common. You certainly see it in all major cities. It's kind of like holding a slum for a long period of time, watching the value of the land go up as the value of the building deteriorates. So this is kind of extracting the value of these kind of slum or older type properties being held until the land value goes to its highest level. And I did the similar kind of analysis of looking at what the possible income was, the vacancy allowance, the operating expenses, what the net income would be. The recapture of the building in this case would hardly be anything because it's ready to be torn down. So in this case, there would be a rather high land residual value of 16. And I also figured a higher land tax of 12, indicating a net land income of 4. I used an 8% cap rate, basically because in buying these types of slum properties, the buyers are not willing to buy them on the same basis at 6% that they would prime properties. But they came up with $50 a square foot as the extracted value. Number 6 of the 7 methods would be a ground rent for leased land. There are situations where you have land that is leased for a long-term basis, 50 years or 100 years, that allows the builder then to build a unit on it and own it for a period of time. And these are quite common in commercial areas and in some residential areas, such as in Irvine, California, where the developer is leasing for a long period of time the land out. So in this case, we found 3 land leases, one at $10 a square foot, one at $9.50 a square foot, and one at $10 a square foot. But we made adjustments for location, for traffic, and for parking. These are site features. And after making the adjustments, we came up with adjusted values of $9.75, $9.50, and $9.50. I determined that in this example, $9.50 is the adjusted rent per square foot. So if we were doing this on a rental basis, we would use $9.50 as indicated ground lease value. Capitalized at 8% again, would have a value of $118.75. So that's showing an example of where you have leased land. My final then example is going to be land subdivision development. This is where you have raw land and you are projecting that over a period of time, you're going to figure out what you're going to buy the land at the lowest price you can. And then you're going to hold it for a period of years. And then you're going to subdivide it and sell it out. And in this case, we're looking at the site being capable of being split into 50 housing units. And each one of them will be able to be sold at $50,000. So that over a period of time, when this subdivision is finally ready and done, there's going to be a sale price of $2,500,000. But we have to subtract all the costs that the developer is going to have before he gets down to that $2.5 million. And one of the biggest ones is going to be a discount over 4 years' time that he's going to have to hold on to it until the subdivision makes sense, until he knows he can get that $50,000. And there's the subdivision cost of going to the public agencies and getting the site approved. Then there's the development costs, that is putting in the sewers and putting in the electric lines, securing the electric lines, the sewers, the water, the streets, the curbs, the sidewalks, and so forth. And then he's going to have a selling price typically 10% when he goes to sell them to builders who will buy, maybe one or half a dozen of them and build houses on them. And then he's going to have the taxes and carrying costs over the period of time. And he's going to want to have some profit at the end. So when we subtract all of these costs out, the buyer, the developer is saying, well, today I'm willing to pay $500,000 in order for over 4 years from now to get the $2.5 million. So that today's price that he's willing to pay is $10,000 for the 50 sites, or the rental price would be $800 for the 50 sites. So that's the seventh method. I'm just going to close. We're going to have questions in just a minute. I'm just going to close by saying that modern technology gives us the advantages in land assessment of, one, facilitating frequent update of markets, ensuring equitable treatment. There's no reason that an assessor could not revalue all property every year. In fact, in British Columbia, in Canada, ever since we set the system up in 1975, they have revalued all the land and all the property every year by simply using their computers and their market analysis. That could be done anywhere, and it is done in a number of cities and states. It eliminates the arithmetic errors in land value calculations. The computers have the advantage of once you get the correct information in, and over a period of time you find the errors, they pop out. You're able to avoid these and to use the computers to do these rapid calculations. We talked about the regression analysis, where you're able to look at maybe hundreds of different characteristics to determine which characteristics are the best, and the computers allow you to do this. And then improving the assessor's productivity. We found that in British Columbia, for example, the work that is done by the assessor in the 50 years time has actually gone, it's so much more productive today than it was in year one. And the same number of staff can do 10 times the work that was able to be done 50 years ago. And employing the standardized assessment techniques have proven to be very effective. So land assessment, in outlining the basic principles and techniques of land assessment, this paper should put to rest the objection that accurate land assessment is impractical or inordinately difficult. Land assessment is a well-understood application of basic economic principles. Land rent, the price paid annually for the exclusive right to use a certain location, a piece of land, or other natural resources. Equity and efficiency require that the general public, the community that created land value, should be paid for the exclusive right to use a land site. And I'm going back to what I started with, my first slide. Henry George said, to abolish all taxation, save that upon land values. So basically that's my talk for tonight, and I'll open it up to questions at this point. I'm going to get rid of my my slides so I can see you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ted. We are open for Q&A, and I see Lars. Lars has a question. Go ahead, Lars.
Be sure when you ask your question that you get your mute down and we see your face when you ask the question. Ask that thing. Otherwise, try to keep your mute on. It's up to you whether or not you want us to show your face all the time or not. But when you ask questions, please take your mute off and show your face. Okay, Lars, go ahead.
My question is, so you talk about best practices in assessment, and you obviously identify as a Georgist, take all this inspiration from Henry George. There's this association you keep referencing in a couple previous talks, like I forget what they are, but like they're like the big assessment institute body that everybody uses and that does the studies.
That's
How,
It's the International Union, I'm sorry, the
Yeah.
IAO, the International Association of Assessing Officers.
right, that one. How Georgist are they? Like, how much of these Georgist best practices are also their best practices? Like, are you super different from all the other assessors? Or is a lot of the stuff you're teaching also the stuff that they're teaching or not?
I can answer that by saying that they are coming, I think, our direction. For example, I gave talks at the International Association meetings, half a dozen different times, and I had good audiences. The Lincoln Institute has a 3-session series at every one of their meetings every year, in which they discuss things that are of interest to the Lincoln Institute, which include land valuation and total property valuation. So I think that generally speaking, the assessors are able to understand quite well how to value total property and how to value land. And I think that now more and more of the assessors are doing a better job at assessing the market value of the total property and coming up with land values that are characteristic, are good. The thing I've said at all meetings are that in most cases, we're just not collecting enough land rent. We collect a small amount, but in most cases, it's much less than 1% of the property value. And if you're collecting a small amount, you're going to have a high land price, as I demonstrated already. And you're not going to have the benefits that would accrue to if you were collecting more land rent, helping the public, being efficient, and so forth. Did I answer your whole question? I guess to put it finally, they're moving our way, but certainly they're not land value taxes like we are. And they are following the rules of the jurisdiction that they fall into, which almost always requires a land and building assessment, but taxes at the same rate. There's only a few jurisdictions that allow you to tax land at a higher rate than buildings. I like to think of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania as a prime example, where the tax rate on land is 6 times higher than the building rate. But Harrisburg is only one city. There's not that many in the world that are doing it the correct way.
Yeah, I've been looking at Pittsburgh's assessments and the dynamics of all this stuff. And our poorest neighborhood, which is high crime and, the way poor neighborhoods are, and our richest residential neighborhood, the land assessment is 85 times as high per lot. And the lots are much smaller because it's a townhouse neighborhood as opposed to a freestanding, older neighborhood. And it occurred to me that the reason for this differential was the taxes, that if I have to pay the same wage tax, whether I live in poor Homewood or rich Shadyside, I might as well pay the high price to live in rich Shadyside. And if we started shifting to a land value tax, I think the land values in Shadyside would probably start going down, and certainly go down relative to the land values in Homewood, because Homewood, nobody wants to pay 85 times as much taxes to live in Shadyside as they have to pay to live in Homewood. So there would be a gradual increasing in the poorest neighborhoods, desirability of the poorest neighborhoods, and less exclusivity of the richest neighborhoods.
Very good point, Dan, for making that. If you have questions, you can either raise your hand physically, or you can hit the little hand button, or let us know in some way. I see Giannis has his hand up, and we actually see Giannis's face. Thank you, Giannis. And take your mute off and ask your question.
Did you got a new camera, Yanis? We
Take
can
your-
hear you.
We can't hear you. You're mute.
You should be able to unmute. There is no restriction here.
There is a, you should see I have it at the bottom of my screen, a
Okay,
microphone.
let me send you a request, Yanni. How about now?
Okay, while we're waiting.
You are
for-
good, Yanni.
Okay, I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm good.
Uh-huh.
All right. I had a question on the capitalization rate, and it looks like you computed all the three variables interchangeably. So I wanted to know which one is the dependent and which one is the independent variable. Like
Okay,
is the capitalization rate a dependent variable on value and income, or which one is the dependent variable? That's my question.
okay. First of all, realize that the capitalization rate, of course, varies for different kinds of property and different locations and different, a whole bunch of different things. That's what the assessor uses. Now, the income approach is primarily used for appraising commercial property. So on commercial property, the owners disclose what their net income is, and we know what the we have the capitalization rate that we've developed. So by dividing the net income by the capitalization rate, we can come up with a value. So in that case, the dependent variable would be the value, the assessment, and the independent variables would be the income and the cap rate.
And also to clarify, the capitalization rate is not to be confused with mortgage rates or lending rates or bank rates of any sort.
Totally different. They're unrelated to mortgage rates and to interest rates in banks, or they're developed by the assessor by doing just what we saw. And that is, the assessor finds a whole group of properties that he has confidence in the selling prices, and he has confidence in the net income. And then he kind of groups them into like downtown areas being one cap rate and suburban being another kind of cap rate and so forth. And so he comes up with different rates and different values depending upon the circumstances. So assessments, requires a lot of judgment. And but in the end, the judgment is checked by the public. And the public either accepts it or they reject it. And if they reject it, we have commercial properties that will, go to court and spend big money to get the cap rate reduced from 6 5/8% to say 6.5%, just because they think our judgment is wrong on how we developed it. But this is the part what the assessor gets involved in, is dealing with the public. And finally, it's kind of a marriage of agreement where the public accepts what the assessor has done, or if it's really bad, they want it redone. I see that Joe has his hand up. So do you want to unmute yourself, Joe, and ask your question?
I think Lars was first.
Well, Lars,
Lars spoke already. So Joe, go ahead.
your turn now.
Thank you.
We'll come back for the second round.
You're right. Great presentation. Very edifying. The computational side, probably people like Ibrahim and Dan and Ed and Rick and Warren can follow easily. For the rest of us, the mere mortals, we have the advantage of being able to watch your videos again later. Thank heaven. Quick question for you. Is there any application for this analysis to climate change? Climate, what's it called? Carbon taxes seem like a good idea. Is there any connection with your analysis in carbon taxes and climate change? Thank you.
I'm sure that there is. I don't know that I have developed it where I can really explain it to you, but I'm sure that there would be. And I think if I can think about this, I might be able to even come up with an example maybe for our next meeting. Thank you for asking that question. Ibrahim, who is next? I guess that Ed Dotson hasn't had a chance yet. Ed, do you want to raise your question?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about how many communities want to preserve open space and also want to often preserve agricultural use. And so communities spend money to purchase the development rights from farmers. And I wondered, in your work in any of the cities you worked in, how the purchase of development rights on sizable portions of parcels of land affected the value of surrounding land.
I haven't had specific experience with the buying of development rights. The one example I had of buying development rights is kind of interesting because it was some waterfront property that there was 6 owners of waterfront property that were all on a cove. And there was of the 6 properties, there was 1 that was vacant and 5 of them were developed. And the 5 that were developed wanted to keep that land vacant. They didn't want anyone to, they owned it. They didn't want anyone to buy it and build a house on it. And they came to me and said that, you know, we can't really afford to keep this vacant site with high taxes that are on the vacant site. And I said, well, the only thing you could really do then would be to dedicate the site to the city, to the town, and it would be exempt. You wouldn't have to pay taxes on it then. And they bought it. They bought that idea. So that was, I guess, to answer your question, they were willing to give this site that they owned to the city in order to prevent it from being developed because it benefited their houses more than anyone else.
Well, what I was thinking of specifically with agricultural use land, Ted, is that it's kind of a dual-edged sword, because on the one hand, if you own the land that's adjacent to or contiguous to the land that's kept in agricultural use, you have fewer neighbors. But on the other hand, you have to deal with the smells that tend to come from agricultural use. And I've noticed in suburban Philadelphia, where new subdivisions have come in, where it's mostly been previously farmland, there's always conflict between the remaining farmers and the people who have paid a large amount of money to buy in a new subdivision next to those farms. And I was just wondering, you know, on the one hand, the contiguous land would probably increase in value because of its privacy. But on the other hand, it might be offset by the fact that you have cows that are still producing manure and methane. And that's kind of what I was getting at.
Okay, that's a good example. I think we have recognized the fact that just about every state has a farmland classification where they give the farmers some advantage for them agreeing not to develop their land, and they're given a lesser assessment, and in some cases they have to repay if they ever do develop it, and so that there are different factors like this that have been developed in various states. But I think that your point about the pluses and minuses of you know, building new houses next to farms, you know, certainly, like I wouldn't want to live right next to a dairy farm. So I would think there'd be a pretty negative adjustment. It would affect my willingness to pay the top price that I would pay for a property that was located without the smell. Okay.
Lars?
Yes. So my next question is about these assessments. So you have all these slides with all these examples, like if it has this, it goes up by this much. If it has that, it goes down by that much. Where are you getting those numbers from? So like this is one of the arguments sometimes people make, that, oh, assessment is all subjective and made up and has no bearing to the market. I assume you're getting those numbers from somewhere that is based off of empirical reality, but could you describe what that is?
Largely what we're doing now is we're using regression analysis. And we, on each property, might have a couple of hundred different characteristics of that property. And by using a regression analysis, we're able to come up with maybe 10 or 20 variables that have a significant impact upon value. Those are often to do with like the size or the function of a house and other things, so that we're able to actually come up, and we will show the formulas to the property owners. We'll say that we have found that in your neighborhood that larger lots sell for a greater price than the standard lot. And it's based upon this analysis, we can tell you exactly how much more it would be. It's not like a guess on our part. It's like we can calculate it mathematically. So the assessor's calculations are almost all mathematical in nature. And being an assessor is really using advanced mathematics and statistics. And this is, when it comes down to it, we have to prove that we've done our best job possible by standing there with the homeowner or standing there with the business operator and showing them exactly the calculations that we made, why we made them, and what they're based upon. So they're not, made up numbers. They're numbers that come from statistics. They come from analysis, and they come from good judgment. And we make errors. And that's why people come challenge the assessors. And a lot of times we have to change some of those numbers because we find out information that changes our viewpoint about the information that we have. I feel like in the end, we come up with a pretty good value where most people are happy. And the few that are unhappy, oftentimes it's with the particular thing. I had one lady in particular that had an exceptionally large house on an exceptionally small lot. And she couldn't understand why why it shouldn't be adjusted downward because of the fact that her lot was not large enough for her house. But I said, but still, it's a lot there. And I was able to convince her that the lot value stood. It didn't drop because of her overbuilding of the house.
Dan? You are muted.
Yeah, Doris, you're unmuted. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. What was it? Oh, the farmland assessments. What I've noticed is that the farmers Pennsylvania has farm use assessment. So everything is supposed to be valued at its use as a farm, as if you could only sell it to another farmer. And it actually does no good at all to the farmers who are out in farm country, because that's all you could sell the farm for anyhow. What the people who it benefits are the people who are farming right on the edge of the suburbs. And if that land were developed as suburbs, then the suburbs would not leapfrog out to the farther out farmland. So the farmland assessments are having the opposite effect of what they're pretending to have.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Dan. I was able to deal with this situation in Greenwich with one property owner that had 100 acres of land that he was farming, and it was right adjacent to very valuable waterfront property. And I was able to, in the case, we had to value it based upon what other comparable land would be selling for, as farmland with water frontage. And I was able to go statewide and come up with enough examples to where I got his value up, not to where it should be, but at least high enough that he understood that we were doing our job, getting as high a value as possible out of it. And most cases that have these benefits to farmers or timberland or whatever often have recapture provisions, so that when it is subdivided, they have to pay back some of the benefit that they've been given, but not always. And Dan is right that it's the ones that are just adjacent to the to the city development that are the real benefiters because they're paying low taxes, speculating so as the price goes up.
Good. It looks like Warren has a question. Warren, would you like to ask your question or you want me to read from the chat?
Well, it's in the chat. That's the question I was going to ask. I was going to ask Ed, what in his opinion was, what states or localities are doing the best and the most timely job of properly assessing, and which are the worst? And I would add, what would your opinion be of Massachusetts, where I live, in terms of how well we do assessments, how often, how accurate, et cetera, and how standardized across the state or the region?
Okay, it's not really fair for me to answer that question. One, because I don't have full total knowledge of everything. And two, things change as time goes on. I do know that there's a couple of states that have done major improvements. Montana is one, and Delaware is another. I think that Massachusetts has had I think a reasonably good record of assessments. I just, it's not really fair to answer the question because things change and I really don't have full knowledge about what everyone is doing. I can say that Connecticut is one example that's really good there because the assessment is done by very competent people that are licensed and educated. They have to go to assessor school and get a degree basically in order to do the job, and they do it frequently, and they use the best techniques. Many of them hire companies, but at least they hire the best companies to do the work, not one that's incompetent. And there's lots of other states that are doing similar, and I can't really answer the question because I don't have full knowledge.
Okay, I was just saying that in Massachusetts, we do, if you get elected to the Board of Assessors, you go to the University of Massachusetts for a course. I don't know how long, I think it's 2 weeks. And we do reassess every 1/3 of the properties every year. So it's like every 3 years, your house will be reviewed. And
those are outstanding. Then I would think that Massachusetts ranks right up there with the best, it sounds like.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Dan, you want to ask another question? Or was that before? You are muted.
I forgot to lower my hand, sorry.
Okay, let's go with Yanis.
Yes, Ted, I would like to ask you, from your multi-decade experience, what data would you like to know about the site that currently is hard to get, or like what would you like to know? What an assessor should know as these data available are no confidential or private. Was I audible?
Okay, yeah, if I couldn't understand your question, you had breaking up as you went along, but I heard size and I heard characteristics. I think you.
No, I was asking. I was asking.
What are the prime characteristics?
I was asking what piece of information would you wish to know, and currently you don't, because it's either confidential or because there is no records, or because what information is key as a Georgist appraiser to know that currently is not easily accessible or easily knowable?
Well, and in terms of land value, the most important factors are its location. First factor is location, and how distant it is to amenities and so forth. And then the size of the property is very important because people pay greater prices for larger sizes. So those two factors, I think, in terms of looking at land values. And then, of course, the other factor in land values is its potential use, like its zoning, whether or not what kind of buildings you can build on it and so forth. All those factors that I brought up right at the beginning were characteristics that have an impact upon land value. But I think the most important are its location and its size and its desirability.
Ed,
Ted, I have actually two what do you think questions. The first one, I have been arguing the case for LVT on YouTube and fairly often with different people. I've been making the case that since a housing unit is a depreciating asset, its value is its depreciated value. And why should we be taxing a depreciating asset? If there's logic in taxing a housing unit, which is an essential good, then we ought to be taxing the depreciated value of our lawnmowers, our refrigerators, our computers, our telephones, and everything else that depreciates. So I think I'm just giving that to the group as an argument against taxing housing and depreciating assets. And I wondered if you would agree.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Assessors used to value all property, including lawnmowers and what was in the house, like stoves and furniture, everything. All of that now has changed. All of that is gone. Now we are still appraising the depreciated value of the house. And I agree with you. I mean, we should be basing it 100% upon land value. It really is silly to value the house.
I've been getting some positive responses from people and saying, yeah, that makes sense. Why should we tax people's houses, which are essential? Okay, the other what if question is Dan Sullivan's idea of self-assessment. And Dan may correct me on what he put forward, but I think I recall him writing at some point that allow property owners to self-assess and give the community an option to purchase the property at the self-assessment value with some adjustment. I don't know, more or less 5% or something. Dan, do I got it about right?
Well, I thought that was appropriate for vacant lots that are not actively involved in a business or something. So if my view of assessment is that it's a service we provide to the taxpayer so he won't have to self-assess. And so he could always declare that he's willing to sell it for a lower price. I would have no problem with a law that says if you put it up for sale at a lower price, we'll lower your assessment, but you have to accept whoever comes along to buy it at that price. But in general, I would say that especially if you're taxing land separately from buildings, well, you can only self-assess and sell the entire property. So if I self-assess the entire property at $150,000, there's still an argument of how much of that was land value. So I would only have self-assessing for vacant land.
Okay,
What do you think?
I agree with what both of you had to say there. My wife, I think, knows the value of every house in our neighborhood. And when they come up for sale, she just says, oh, that one's, that one's 5% higher than it should be listed for, So, I mean, people pretty much know their values. I've even found, going into some of the towns in Russia that I was able to speak to general people, just casually. I would say, well, which is the best location in town? And everyone had the same idea exactly. And then I'd say, well, how much better or worse are properties in this location compared to that location? So, self-assessment or gathering information from the public, I think, can be valuable. The other thing I did in Hartford, Connecticut, was I got all the businessmen together for a session. And they developed my land value map for me, basically, because they absolutely knew exactly which was the best site, and they knew how much to change it as you went along. They knew where the primary properties were located and where the ones to be developed were located. So those are all kinds of things that the assessor can kind of use, along with the analysis of sales information and regression analysis and so forth, to give them all the data that helps them do the job properly.
Thanks.
Scott Baker.
Scott, do you have a question?
Hi, Ted.
Hi.
Thank you for this session. I think it's actually been the most involved and detailed session yet. I want to know, how do you determine which of the 7 methods of assessment to use? Is just dependent on which variables you have knowledge of, or is there political aspect to it, or some other advantage to use one versus another?
Well, the answer to that question is you always use number 1, which is the sales method. And usually you're able to do all your work on number 1 alone. But you sometimes run into situations where there isn't enough sales information or rental information. So then you can kind of fall back on some of these, hypothetical ones where you do a land residual based upon an income approach. And those can be used effectively when you don't have enough. But the answer to your question is that number 1 is the method that is always used. And it's the one that hopefully the only one that needs to be used. But the other ones, are there for those difficult properties or for coming up with values where you don't have enough information.
So I would assume that in a dense urban area, you'd be able to use number 1 pretty much all the time.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. James.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm thinking of what it would take to make a sea change in our society and have people accept this as a superior way to tax things, especially if they were to gain value in their own house by the exercise of it. So my question is this: are there estimates available of financial benefits to average citizens under land value taxation such that they would want to vote with their wallets? Oh, sorry, I meant to turn this on. Yeah.
Okay, I know of one example, and that is in 2010 in California. I worked with an attorney who had in his mind to rewrite Proposition 13. Proposition 13 basically limits the amount of increase that properties can incur. And he rewrote Proposition 13, which basically said land is taxable, buildings are not taxable. And then we actually went through and he wrote the legislation, sent it to the state government, got it approved as being a sound measure that could be voted on in a referendum. And in the course of that, we did examples showing different classes of homeowners, how much they would save by doing away with the state income tax, doing away with the state sales tax, doing away with the taxes on their house, doing away with the taxes on their businesses, doing away with basically all taxes except the land value tax. And everyone benefited. There was no one, the only ones who didn't benefit were the ones that held vacant land, basically that were not utilizing their land to its highest and best use. Everyone else benefited, and we were able to show dollars and cents. We actually were able to show how many dollars they would save. And we did a calculation on a spreadsheet showing, this is how much you're currently paying on average in sales tax, in income tax, and in building taxes. And we were able to actually calculate it for them. Now, unfortunately, this died simply because it was going to take $3 million to get someone to get the signatures signed to go to a referendum vote in California. And we didn't have that kind of money, and we weren't able to generate that kind of money. But that was 10 years ago. At least it shows it can be done. I think the same thing could be done anywhere. I think it's a matter simply of people getting a hold of data. Like we were able to grab data in California because it's all published, it's all available, easy to access. But you can do the same in virtually any state or any country. And you could come up with looking at these scenarios about, well, let's just assume that we would do away with all taxes. In fact, I've already done this in 4 countries. I did it in England. I showed them. I did it in a few other countries. I can't think of which ones right now, but I've done this kind of in a global way of showing how the property tax or the land value tax was adequate to fund all purposes. In fact, I haven't been able to find any example where it's not adequate to fund all purposes.
Allentown, Pennsylvania, put land value tax in their home rule charter, which had to be approved by referendum. And opponents of the land value tax outspent supporters by more than 100 to 1. And what we did, what Josh Vincent primarily did, was sent every homeowner a letter telling him what his tax bill would be under land value tax and under the property tax. And that passed easily despite the massive outspending. And then 5 years later, the same people tried to repeal the land tax provision in the home rule charter. We were again outspent 100 to 1. Josh once again sent letters to every homeowner saying what the repeal would cost them in additional taxes. And it again, the repeal failed easily. So it can be done. And I keep telling Georges what you need is to preach less and do more research and provide more data.
Very good, Dan. I see Josh's face there. And Josh, if you want to say something, unmute your mute button and say something. There you go.
Hi, everybody. I came in a little late, but I just wanted to talk about Allentown a little bit. And what we had was a coalition of trade unions, mostly the United Auto Workers, and also arch capitalists. Pat Toomey, who is now one of the most fiscally conservative U.S. senators in the country, supported land value tax.
Conservative in all ways, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't bring him to a bar, but I think that what we had was a little bit of small business, because Pat Toomey at the time was a small businessman, and he said, "Oh, for my God, I'm improving my properties, I'm opening new businesses, and they're just hammering me with higher nuisance taxes and higher property taxes." And he said, "Why is that happening?" And that's how we ended up with, frankly, that's how we ended up with Henry George. But we also had the union members and the small business people on our side. And eventually, sorry, I'm doing this on my phone. Eventually, what we had in Allentown was, as Dan said, we had we had a popular vote and a mass mail campaign, just like Jerry Falwell would have done for his cause, and it worked. And in fact, in the end, what I think really counts is that the people in the 2 wards that paid more, residentially speaking, that they passed it in their wards by the same ratio of about 2 to 1. And Marty Velazquez, the city council president, Steve Cord and myself and Artie Yateman and a lot of other Georgists were working on election day. And Marty Velazquez looked up at the airplane that said dump the land tax with a little banner. And he said, well, look at it this way, guys. If the plane crashes into a school, you've saved LVT. But luckily it didn't crash. And I think that what he was saying is that this is absurd. They spent a lot of money. I think Dan is quite correct. They spent a lot of money to defeat this. So it works, and it can work on a popular basis. I don't know. I don't think Dan was there, but Mike Curtis was, and a lot of people. And we went to the Nation of Islam mosque and just said, "Hey, this is what's going on," and we won. Okay, off the soapbox.
Josh, by the way, has a wonderful computer system where he's able to go into a city and capture the values and display what the impact of making minor changes, collecting more revenue from land and less from the improvements would result in. And he can go house by house and show the results. So that's something to consider. He's, I know, done it in
Yeah, it is. And if I may say, and this will be the last, in Allentown, we also worked with the business community and we froze local business taxes. Dan knows them as Act 511 taxes, which are nuisance taxes on business. And we froze them at the 1995 levels where they stay. And so we got a lot of buy-in from the business community, from real capitalists.
Joe, is your hand up? I can't.
Amazing. Douglas would like to ask a question. He hasn't spoken, so let's give a chance to Douglas. Go ahead, Douglas.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you have a reference on the, you mentioned tax in California, land value tax in California. I live in Monterey, California, and I've been arguing with city council or trying to talk about this to the city council and the mayor. And if I could get a reference about your attempts to put land value tax in California, that would give me some arguing points. Thank you.
No one has really written it up. I suppose that's something I should do, is write it up so that I can give it to you and others that are interested in it. I'll take that as a suggestion from you.
Joe will give you the last word.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure.
Sorry.
I just wanted to say, conservative economists like land value tax, like Milton Friedman, because it's economically more efficient, that is less disruptive to the entrepreneur and wealth creation. And a lot of conventional economists like Paul Samuelson have said the same. So it has a strong economic theoretical support, as well as the appeal to the public that Dan described.
Okay, thank you. So are we set for the evening then? I hope to see you all in 2 weeks on September 13th. Next week is Labor Day, so don't phone in on Labor Day. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you. See you on the 13th, as Ted just mentioned. Good night.
Night.
Good night.